My name is Officer Tim Bullock. I'm a law enforcement officer with North Carolina Wildlife Resources Commission. Today we're here at Foothills Shooting Complex and we're going to discuss some archery, some basic fundamentals. We're going to go over some safety. We're going to go over some nomenclature of the bows and things that you want to take into account when you're beginning to get into archery. Today, the first thing we want to talk about safety. And safety is paramount when you're shooting or beginning in archery. As you can see behind me, we have targets set up. What you want to make sure is you have a good target and you also have a good solid backstop in case you do happen to miss your target. You don't have an arrow flying somewhere that could injure someone or something. So begin with that, find a good range or an area where you can shoot safely and keep that in mind. So the first thing we want to talk about is we want to go ahead and go into the arrow. And the first thing we're going to do is go through the arrow and show you points that is very important. First thing you have is your fletchings here. What they're going to do is sometimes you have a different helical on your fletchings, whether it's left or right, and it just gives you an arrow flight. As the arrow spins, it just basically gives it a truer flight, and it's important to make sure that these are in good working order. You want to inspect them and look at them. The next piece you have on is your nock. And the nock is what attaches to your arrow string. You want to make sure that it is in good working order, no cracks. Just make sure it's in there really solid. This is going to connect to your arrow string and help release off the arrow. The next thing you have is the arrow shaft, and these come in a variety of different materials. You have aluminum, you have carbon, you have wood. It just depends on how you're going to get started and what you're going to shoot. The very next part that you have is your field point or your broadhead, depending on if you're in a hunting situation. You would have a arrowhead or field point. Always recommend that when you're practicing your archery, you use a field point. It's less damage on your target and it's much safer. Your broadhead is going to be very sharp, so it's important that you are safely handling the broadhead because it could cut you given if it's mishandled. So always use your field point when you're beginning to get on the range. All right, the next thing we want to talk a little bit about is some accessories that you will use. If you look here in the manual, you will see some things that you may need when you begin. You may need a arm guard, depending on how you hold your bow, which is very important to alleviate string slap, and we'll discuss that a little bit. You'll need a release if you're shooting a compound bow. You will need finger tabs, and you will also need two different types. There's ones that just go on the tips of your fingers and one that goes around your wrist, so either one that you choose to use. But you'll need those based on what type of arrow or bow that you're going to shoot. We're going to talk a little bit about the bows. If you see here on the table, we have, this is a recurve bow, which is traditional archery. It's a lot different than using your compound bow, and we'll discuss a little bit about the differences in the compound bow. And you have also left and right-handed types of bows. If you look at your recurve bow first, you see it's a little different than your compound, and then it's very traditional and it's very basic. Traditional archery is no sights, no cams, none of the fancy things that go on a compound bow. Traditional archery is point and shoot. And when you begin traditional archery, it's always good to start with traditional because it gives you a good foundation and all of the follow through and the things that you need to know to make you a good archer if you move into compound. And as you can see with this, there is nothing on this bow except the limbs and the string. So when you put your arrow in the bow, when you pull back, traditional or instinctive shooting is you are looking at your target and then you release the arrow. And that is going to be a lot different than your compound bow because you will have sights, and then we'll discuss that in a little more detail. But your traditional archery is a good foundation to begin with because it will give you all the necessary moves and fundamentals for you to move into something more extensive. So if you look at your compound bow, you'll notice you do have a big difference here as far as the bells and whistles that you have. If you have a fully set up compound bow, of course you have your string, you have your limbs here, you have what they call cams, and when the bow is pulled back, the cams break over, and this is what generates your torque and power. Whether your traditional bow, you just have the limbs, depending on the length of the bow. Also with your compound bow, you're going to have an arrow rest. You're going to have sights on the front of the bow. You're going to have what they call a stabilizer in the front of the bow, and what that does is it kind of gives you a balance. If you were to pick this bow up, you could tell that it may feel a little heavier at the bottom or at the top, depending on the configuration. But that stabilizer will give it the balance. As when you shoot, it also will allow you to have less vibration because you have a lot of moving parts in this bow versus your traditional. So you need more bells and whistles to get this to shoot more accurate than you would on your traditional bow because it's so much simpler. Of course, you have your front, your bottom limbs and your top limbs, and here on the limbs as they're connected, you have braces here, and some of these can be adjusted to the poundage that you're pulling. So when I say poundage, what I mean is when you pull the bow back this way, as those limbs break over, there's a certain amount of torque or poundage, and what you have to do is you have to adjust that to your liking, because you do not want to struggle when you pull the bow back. It should be nice and smooth. So if the bow is set up for maybe 60 pounds, 65 pounds, that means you will have to pull that amount of torque until the bow breaks over. So if that's too much, you need to have your bow shop lower the poundage, which is real simple to do. It just depends on what you're used to pulling or what's comfortable for you. So that's really important to do that. Some of the things that we can look at here as far as your compound bow versus your traditional archery is you're going to notice on your traditional archery there are no sights. So you're instinctively shooting. That means you're looking at your target, you're pulling the bow back, and you're releasing. With your compound bow, you have sights, and you have certain yardage pins. And so this is what your field of view would look like when you pull that bow back. The biggest differences that you have to remember is with your traditional archery, when you pull the bow back, this poundage stays the same all the way through the pull. So when you pull this bow back, you do not want to hold it very long. You want to pull it back, get your target, and then release your arrow. With this bow, being that you have the cams, when this bow is pulled back and the cam breaks, I can hold this a lot longer. So there's advantages and disadvantages to that. The advantage to that is I could set my sight picture a little better. The disadvantage is the longer I hold this, the more I can do this. So it's important to practice to see what method is working best for you, because this will be a very quick shot, so it takes a lot of practice. Shooting instinctive is a very good skill to have, and it will help you when you move in to this particular type of bow. All right, let's talk a little bit about drawing and anchoring your bow. In order for you to be consistent, when you draw and anchor your bow, when I say anchor, what I'm referring to is when I draw the bow, I want to anchor at a point every single time, so I know that I'm consistent. So when I draw the bow, I anchor at a certain point. That's what you mean by a smooth draw. So what I normally do, and it depends on how you're shooting, is this knuckle right here. When I draw that bow back, it's locked under my ear every single time. So I know when I get in that position that I'm in the right position for me to draw my bow to be consistent. And that's really important. With your traditional archery, you can do the same thing. You always want to have an anchor point. With traditional archery, I usually draw back to the corner of my lip, because these are different bows with different mechanics. So it's basically a draw, find your target, and release. So depending on what bow you're shooting, it's very important to make sure that you have the same anchor point for consistency. Another fundamental that you need to be very aware of is called follow through. The biggest mistake that most new archers make is everybody wants to see their shot. They want to see where it goes. So when they draw their bow back and they release their arrow, they do this. So, and you see it very consistent because everybody wants to see where their shot went. So follow through is basically when you pull the bow back and you release and you hold this position right here. Then you can look at your shot, because if you pull the bow back and then you release at the same time that you jerk to look, you're going to drift your shot off target. So follow through is very important. Same thing with your traditional archery. It's no different. All these fundamentals carry over to each one. Draw back, release, and you'll stay in this position, and then you'll find your target. So one of the last things we'll talk about when we talk about the arrow is I want to give you a little demonstration or show you some different broadheads that you'll be using for different types of archery. So what you'll do is you'll basically have a field point, and this is going to be used for your practice. The grain of the field point, when it's taken out of the bow, the field point will weigh the same amount as whatever broadhead that you're shooting to give you consistency. So if you have a 100 grain broadhead, you'll use a 100 grain weight field point. When I say broadhead, what I'm referring to is, if you look here, you have different types of broadheads depending on what you're going to use. This is your standard field point. This is what they call a blunt tip field point. This is a judo point, a fish point. Then you have cut on contact broadhead. Then you have a mechanical broadhead. And these are going to be used for different scenarios. Your larger broadheads and your mechanical broadheads are going to be for hunting big game. You have a fish point, which a lot of people do a lot of bow fishing for non-game species, and that's the type of point you will use. You have a judo point, which is used for small game, and then of course your field point when you are just practicing. The main thing that you want to make sure is that when you store your arrows, that you use some sort of quiver, and this is called a quiver. What it does is it stores your arrows safely in transport. Some of the quivers will attach actually to your bow. The biggest reason you want to do this is, one, is for safety, depending on if you have broadheads on your arrow, because the broadheads are razor sharp and you want to make sure that they are contained until you're ready to use them. Also, it just keeps your arrows and your fletchings in good working order, and rather than having to carry them by hand or possibly losing one. So make sure you have a quiver when you're using your arrows or transporting your arrows. So when we're shooting traditional archery or our compound bows, our release, our follow through is very important, as well as our stance. So to begin our stance, if we're facing our target, what we're going to do is have our body facing away from our target, and your left shoulder or your right shoulder, depending on what hand you shoot with, will be facing that target. So you'll be standing basically like this, drawing your bow, and then release. When you're holding your bow with your left or right hand on the limb of the bow, one thing that you need to be mindful of is, we talked earlier about string slap. And string slap occurs when if you pull the bow back and your hand or arm is in the way of the string. So if I was to let that string go, the torque would slap my hand. Okay? If you set up that way and you have to shoot that way, they make a strap that goes on your arm so it will not affect you. But the easiest way to correct that is you're going to cant your hand at a 45. These fingers here will drop down, and you're basically holding the bow in the web of your hand. So what that does is it automatically cants your arm away from the string. So when I pull the bow back now, if I'm holding it this way, my arm's completely out of the way from the string. So you want to keep your stance. Your grip is important. Holding your bow and your follow through, all of these motions are together. So if you do these things each and every time consistently, your shots will be consistent downrange. So it's basically your stance, holding your bow, canting your hand, drawing your bow, finding your anchor point that we talked about right here, and then releasing. And then your shots will be more consistent. If you do everything consistent here, shots will be consistent downrange. In concluding, talking about archery, it's a very easy family activity to be involved in. If you have a range close, or if you have friends or someone where you can come out, Foothills Shooting Complex offers 3D archery. We offer targets that you can shoot at. Very nice covered facility. If you want to get out with a family and begin, I would recommend children as young as 8 can get out and learn the fundamentals. Anyone younger than that, they can still learn the fundamentals. And it just depends on how much they can draw the bow back just to get them out and get them involved. It's a very inexpensive beginner activity for a family. You could possibly have one bow set up for multiple children, and they could take turns. So you can use different kinds of targets. I mean, you can go as inexpensive as a hay bale and go all the way up to more expensive targets. So it's just a matter of getting out, getting involved, and enjoying the outdoors and getting started.